She cleaned his house every day, cared for his children as if they were her own, and never asked for anything in return. Until the day Eduardo came home early and found his girlfriend humiliating this woman, who, in silence, simply hugged the twins. It was then that he understood who truly loved his children. Eduardo Matarado had a habit few knew. Every time he entered his own home, he would pause in the entrance hall and listen. It wasn't paranoia, it was control. The same control he wielded in holding meetings, in million-dollar contracts, in negotiations that stretched into the early hours. Eduardo disliked surprises. Eduardo liked to know exactly what was happening in every corner of his world. That afternoon, he returned early, a last-minute meeting cancellation. The driver dropped him at the gate, and Eduardo dismissed the car with a quick gesture. He walked around the side of the house, entering through the back door, something he almost never did. He crossed the empty kitchen and then stopped. He stopped because he heard a voice he didn't recognize. It wasn't the tone, it was the cruelty. You think you can sit on the living room couch as if you're family. The voice came from the corridor connecting the kitchen to the main living room. Eduardo took 2 steps and became partially hidden behind the wall. What he saw in the following seconds changed the entire direction of his life. Denise stood in the center of the room, her index finger pointed like a weapon. Her body leaned forward, dominant, occupying space as if marking territory. And in front of her, cornered against the wall, was Clara. Clara wasn't crying. Clara wasn't shouting. Clara was silent, both hands holding Tay and Enzo's shoulders, keeping the twins behind her body. The boy's eyes were wide. Enzo held the hem of Clara's uniform so tightly that his fingers were white. I've already told you I don't want these boys running around the house when I'm here. And I've already told you that you are not a nanny. You're the cleaner. Clean as clean. They don't sit. They don't eat at the table. They don't play with Eduardo's children as if they were family. Denise spoke without raising her voice. This was the detail that chilled Eduardo's blood. She wasn't out of control. She was calculated. Every word came out like a precise, surgical instruction designed to diminish. Clara swallowed hard. Eduardo saw the movement of her throat, saw her shoulders rise and fall once. And then Clara did something Eduardo would never forget. She knelt, got down to his children's level, and whispered something in Tay's ear. The boy nodded. Clara stood up, took each of the twins' hands, and began walking towards the corridor, the same corridor where Eduardo was hidden. I haven't finished speaking with you. Clara stopped, didn't turn around, took a deep breath, and said, without looking back, with a voice so firm it seemed made of iron. Yes, you have, because in front of these children, you will not say another word. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but to Eduardo, it felt like an eternity. Denise opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. For the first time since Eduardo knew her, Denise Bulhões had no reply. Clara kept walking. The twins held her hands. Tay looked straight ahead, chin raised, unconsciously imitating Clara. Enzo still trembled, but he didn't let go of her hand. Eduardo retreated 3 steps, leaning against the kitchen wall, feeling the cold marble on his back. His hands were clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. He stood there for a long time. He didn't know how long. He heard Clara's footsteps going up the stairs with the boys. He heard the distant sound of a door closing and then silence. In the living room, Denise picked up her phone and sat on the couch, as if nothing had happened. Eduardo didn't confront anyone that afternoon, didn't say a word, went up to his office, locked the door, and looked out the window overlooking the garden. The garden Clara kept impeccable. Although it wasn't part of her duties, the garden where the twins played every afternoon, the garden Denise never set foot in. The image wouldn't leave his head. It wasn't Denise's aggression, although that had struck him like a blow. It was something else. It was Clara kneeling down to the boy's level. It was the whisper. It was the hand holding a hand. It was the voice that didn't tremble. It was the dignity. Eduardo knew powerful people, bank presidents, judges, senators, people who spoke loudly, who commanded rooms, who bent wheels. But he had never seen power like that. The power of someone who has nothing, no title, no surname, no bank account, and yet refused to be diminished. Not out of pride, not out of anger, but because there were 2 children who needed to see that someone in that house had the courage to say enough. Yes, you have, because in front of these children, you will not say another word. The phrase echoed. Eduardo repeated it mentally, once, twice, 10 times, and with each repetition, something inside him shifted, like a piece of furniture that had been in the wrong place for so long that he had grown accustomed to circumventing it. Now, suddenly, he saw the empty space where the piece should be. When was the last time he himself protected the twins from something? When was the last time he knelt down to their level and whispered something that made them feel safe? Eduardo Matarado knew how to close $80 million contracts, knew how to read balance sheets, anticipate market trends, identify corporate risks before any analyst, but he didn't know his children's teacher's name. He didn't know that Enzo was afraid of thunder. He didn't know that Tay drew every night before bed and hid the drawings under his pillow. Clara knew. Clara knew because she was the one who put the boys to bed when Eduardo had business dinners. She was the one who warmed the milk to the right temperature, who checked under the bed to prove there were no monsters, who left the hallway light on because Enzo couldn't sleep in total darkness. Eduardo knew none of this, and the shame of that ignorance was worse than anything he had ever felt. It was past 10 p.m. when he went downstairs. The house was silent. Denise had left, probably for her downtown apartment, as she did when she didn't want to stay. Eduardo walked to the twins' room, opened the door slowly. Both were sleeping. Tay was on his stomach, his arm hanging off the bed. Enzo was wrapped in his blanket like a cocoon, his face serene. Between the two beds, on the nightstand, was a glass of water with a slice of lemon, exactly as Enzo liked it. And next to the glass, a folded piece of paper. Eduardo picked up the paper, opened it. It was a drawing by Tay. 4 stick figures, 2 small boys holding hands, a woman beside them, taller, with a wide smile, and above the 3, written in a child's shaky, enormous handwriting, a single word: family. The 4th figure, a man, was on the other side of the paper, alone, without a smile, with a briefcase in his hand. Eduardo stood, staring at that drawing for so long that his eyes began to sting, not from anger, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. His own children had drawn their family, and their family didn't include his girlfriend, didn't include any of the people Eduardo thought mattered. Their family was Clara. He was the man with the briefcase on the other side of the paper, alone. Eduardo folded the drawing carefully, put it in his suit pocket, and left his children's room with a certainty he didn't yet have words to describe, but which already weighed like lead in the center of his chest. He went downstairs to the kitchen. Miss Zilda was there, as almost always, organizing the provisions for the next morning. The cook had worked in the house since before the twins were born. She knew every corner, every sound, every silence of that mansion. Zilda. The cook turned slowly, assessing his expression with the experience of someone who had read faces for decades. You saw? It wasn't a question. Eduardo sat on the kitchen island bench, something he never did. He always ate in the dining room, always with correct posture, always in the right place. But that night he sat in the kitchen like a man who no longer knew where he belonged. How long has this been going on, Zilda? The cook opened a drawer, took out a dishcloth, and began drying glasses that were already dry. Her hands needed movement for her mouth to speak. Since the beginning. Eduardo closed his eyes. Why didn't anyone tell me? Miss. Zilda placed the glass on the shelf, turned to him, and said something Eduardo would carry for the rest of his life. Because you never stayed long enough to see. The kitchen clock ticked away each second. Eduardo looked at his own hands. Hands that signed contracts, that shook investors' hands, that never trembled. That night, they trembled. And Clara, what does she do when this happens? Zilda offered a small smile, sad and proud at the same time. The same thing you saw today. She takes the boys and removes them from the scene. She never yells, never retaliates, never complains to anyone. After the boys fall asleep, she comes back and finishes her work as if nothing had happened. Every time, every time. Eduardo ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and asked the question that, in truth, wasn't about Clara. It was about him. Zilda, are my children happy? The cook paused, looked at him with a compassion Eduardo didn't deserve, but which she offered nonetheless. Your children are loved, Eduardo, but not by whom you think. The kitchen fell silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock. Eduardo stood from the bench, walked to the door, and stopped. Tomorrow I need coffee earlier. It'll be ready. Eduardo went back up the stairs to his office, but he didn't sleep. He stayed up all night sitting in the armchair with Tay's drawing open on the table. 4 stick figures, 3 together, 1 separate. And for the first time in many years, Eduardo Matarado didn't know what his next step would be. Because all the next steps he could imagine required something that money couldn't buy. Courage to see what he had refused to see. Eduardo didn't sleep. When the first light of morning entered through the office curtain gaps, he was still in the same position. Tay's drawing remained open on the table, like a map revealing a territory he had never explored. His own children's emotional lives. He went downstairs before anyone else in the house woke up. The kitchen already smelled of coffee. Miss Zilda kept promises with her usual precision. Eduardo sat on the same bench as the night before. The cook placed the cup in front of him without saying a word. She didn't need to. The silence between them already carried everything that had been said last night. Eduardo drank his coffee slowly. Each sip felt different, not because the coffee was different, but because he was paying attention to the sounds of the house, waking up, to the footsteps upstairs, to the boys' bathroom faucet, and then a sound he had never noticed before, a soft voice, humming softly. Clara. She was singing to the twins as she helped them get ready. Eduardo couldn't distinguish the melody. It was something simple, perhaps an old song that passed from mother to daughter without anyone remembering where it came from. But the effect was clear. Laughter. His children's laughter, one after another, then both together, mingled with Clara's voice. Eduardo placed the cup on the table, stood still, listening. How long had it been since he heard his children laugh like that? Not the polite laughter they offered at formal dinners. Not the restrained smiles they showed when Denise was present, but real laughter. The kind that comes from deep in the chest, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that only happens when a child feels safe. The twins ran downstairs. Tay in front, as always, the bravest, the one who was first in everything. Enzo right behind, clutching a drawing book to his chest like a shield. Both stopped when they saw their father in the kitchen. Dad. The surprise in Tay's voice hurt more than any word Denise had said the day before. The boy was genuinely astonished to find his father there at that hour, in that place, as if Eduardo were a visitor in his own home. Good morning. Eduardo tried to smile. Tay looked at Enzo. Enzo looked at Tay. That silent communication only twins master. An entire language made of glances and micro-expressions that the rest of the world couldn't translate. Aren't you going to work today, sir? Enzo asked cautiously. Sir. His children called him sir. Eduardo swallowed the information like someone swallowing something that scraped his entire throat on the way down. Yes, I am, but I wanted to have breakfast with you today. Another glance between the twins. This time something different. A shadow of hope mixed with distrust. The distrust of those who have already learned, even so young, that adult promises are fragile. Clara appeared at the top of the stairs. Eduardo saw her before she saw him. She wore her work uniform, her hair tied back, her hands still damp from helping the boys wash their faces. When she noticed Eduardo in the kitchen, she paused. A brief, almost imperceptible pause, like someone recalculating a route mid-journey. Good morning, Mr. Eduardo. Her voice was professional, neutral, the same voice as always. No trace of the woman who hours earlier had faced Denise with the firmness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Clara went down the stairs, went straight to the cleaning supplies cupboard, and began organizing the day's materials. Eduardo observed her. For the first time, he truly observed. He saw how Clara moved through the house, unhurriedly, yet without waste. Every gesture had a purpose. She knew exactly where everything was, not because she was obligated to know, but because she treated that house as if it mattered. She adjusted a cushion on the couch, repositioned a slightly crooked photo frame on the shelf, paused before the living room window, and opened the curtains with a broad movement, letting the light flood the room. The twins went to her before going to the table. They didn't go to their father. They went to Clara. Tay showed something in Enzo's notebook, and Clara leaned in to look, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder as she listened. Enzo pointed to a detail in the drawing. Clara nodded, said something Eduardo couldn't hear, and Enzo smiled the way only children smile when someone takes something they've made seriously. Eduardo was less than 5 meters away and was invisible. Breakfast took place in partial silence. The twins ate and exchanged glances. Eduardo tried to start a conversation twice. They answered with short, polite phrases without substance. Enzo merely nodded. It wasn't rebellion. It was distance. The distance of someone who doesn't know how to behave near someone who should be familiar but isn't. When the boys finished, they got up from the table and headed towards the door, where the driver was already waiting to take them to school. They stopped halfway, turned and said, "Dad, can Clara pick us up today?" Eduardo frowned. "Pick you up, but the driver always takes and picks you up. Clara picks us up better." Eduardo was about to ask what that meant, but Tay had already left. Enzo stood for a second longer, looking at his father with something Eduardo couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was something between expectation and resignation, as if the boy wanted to say something but had long ago given up on being heard. When the door closed, Eduardo was alone in the dining room. "MS," Zilda was clearing the dishes. Clara had already disappeared upstairs. And then Eduardo did something out of his pattern. He picked up his phone, called the office, and told his assistant he wouldn't be in that morning. Reschedule everything for the afternoon. There was a surprised silence on the other end of the line. Eduardo Matarado didn't reschedule meetings. Eduardo Matarado was the meetings, but the assistant merely confirmed and hung up. Eduardo stayed in the house and began to pay attention to everything. He observed Clara changing the twins' bed linen with a care that went beyond professional. He saw how she smoothed the sheets with her hands, as if preparing a nest. He saw that in Enzo's room, she placed the pillow on the left side because the boy slept facing the door, and in Tay's room, the pillow was in the center, because he slept on his stomach and needed more space. Small, silent details, invisible to those not looking. Clara knew how each of his children slept. Eduardo didn't. He went down to his office and sat before the computer. But he didn't open spreadsheets. He opened the left-hand drawer where he kept personal documents. He looked for Clara's employment record, found it. Full name, Clara de Souza Ventura, hired just over 3 years ago. References, 2 previous families, both with praise. Marital status, single. Dependents, none. Address, a modest neighborhood in the North End. That was all he knew about the woman who raised his children. Eduardo leaned back in his chair and stared at that file, as one stares at a mirror that reflects not the face, but the character. 3 years. Clara had been in the twins' lives for 3 years. She had seen their first steps to school, their first written words, their first fears, their first difficult questions. And Eduardo had reduced all of that to a 6-line employment record. The phone rang. Eduardo looked at the screen. Denise. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. The phone stopped. Seconds later, a message. Love? Dinner tonight? I booked that restaurant you like. Eduardo read the message and felt something he didn't expect. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No warmth, no anticipation, no desire to see her. As if the woman who wrote that message was a stranger he had met at a party, whose presence no longer made any difference. He put his phone in his pocket without replying. The afternoon arrived, and Eduardo forced himself to go to the office. He went through meetings on autopilot, physically present, absent in everything else. His partner, Mauricio, noticed something different during an important negotiation. Eduardo, are you with us? I am. Doesn't seem like it. Eduardo didn't explain. He wouldn't know how. How to tell his partner that the CEO of a billion-dollar holding company had been undone by a stick figure drawing. How to explain that a cleaner had said 7 words that were worth more than all the leadership speeches he had ever given. Yes, you have. Because in front of these children, you will not say another word. 7 words, without shouting, without trembling, without asking permission. Eduardo left the office early for the 2nd consecutive time. Another thing that never happened. When he got home, he went straight to the kitchen. Zilda was preparing dinner. Zilda, I need to ask you something. The cook dried her hands on her apron and waited. My children, do they talk about me? Zilda looked at him with that gaze, that mixed compassion, with an old hardness, of someone who had seen too much to sugarcoat truths. They talk about Clara. Eduardo nodded slowly. The answer was expected, but hearing it out loud carried a different weight, a weight of judgment. And when Denise is here? Zilda returned to stirring the pot. The clatter of the spoon against the metal bottom filled the silence for a few seconds. When Denise is here, the boys stay in their room. They don't come down. They don't make noise. They eat quickly and ask to be excused. Since when? Since always. Eduardo leaned against the counter. His hands gripped the marble edge so tightly that his knuckles ached. And I never noticed. Zilda didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was more eloquent than any accusation. Eduardo left the kitchen and went upstairs. In the 2nd floor corridor, he heard voices coming from the twins' room. The door was ajar. He approached silently and peered through the crack. Clara was sitting on the floor between the 2 beds. Tay was lying on his stomach on his bed, chin resting in his hands, looking at Clara. Enzo was on the floor beside her, leaning against her arm, his drawing book open on his lap. Clara, are you leaving? Enzo asked, without lifting his eyes from the notebook. Eduardo felt the air leave his lungs. Why are you asking that? Because the blonde lady said she was going to send you away. Clara didn't answer immediately. Eduardo saw her shoulders move, a long, controlled breath of someone choosing each word with surgical care. Enzo, look at me. The boy looked up. As long as you need me, I'll be here, no matter what anyone says. Understand? Enzo nodded. Tay from his bed reached out. Clara took it, and Enzo placed his hand on top of theirs. 3 hands stacked like a pact. Eduardo retreated, his back against the corridor wall. His eyes stung, his throat was tight. He reached into his suit pocket and felt the folded paper, Tay's drawing he had been carrying since the night before. In that silent corridor, Eduardo Matarado understood something no financial report, no market analysis, and no consultant could ever have taught him. He hadn't lost his children to another person. He had surrendered them. Day after day, meeting after meeting, trip after trip, he had given up his presence. And into the space he left empty, Clara entered, not out of ambition, not out of strategy, but because someone needed to be there, and she chose to stay. And the woman he had brought into his home to be his companion was the same one trying to expel the only person his children loved. Eduardo went downstairs, picked up his phone, read Denise's message once more, and typed a reply that was, in fact, the beginning of a demolition. "We need to talk in person tomorrow." He sent it, put his phone away, and for the first time in years, went to his children's room, opened the door, and asked, "Can I stay here with you?" Tay and Enzo looked at him with the same surprise as that morning. Clara immediately rose from the floor, as if the employer's presence required her to vacate the space. Eduardo looked at her and did something Clara didn't expect. "Stay, Clara, please." Clara stopped, looked at the twins. The boys looked at her, and Enzo, with the brutal naturalness only a child possesses, resolved the situation. "Sit here, Dad." Clara was telling a story. Eduardo sat on the floor of his own children's room for the first time in his life and listened to Clara tell a story about a bird that couldn't fly, but that walked so far it knew more places than all the other birds combined. Tay fell asleep first, then Enzo with his head resting on Clara's shoulder, and Eduardo stayed there on the floor in silence, looking at the woman who carried the weight of his world, never having asked for anything in return. That night, Eduardo didn't sleep in the master bedroom. He slept in the office armchair with Tay's drawing in his pocket and a question that wouldn't leave him alone. If he took Clara out of that house, what would be left of his children? And if he took Denise out, what would be left of him? Eduardo woke up in the office armchair with a stiff body and a mind heavier than when he closed his eyes. Tay's drawing was still in his suit pocket. It was no longer just a piece of paper. It was an accusation he carried against himself. He slowly got up, changed clothes, and went downstairs. The house was still silent. The twins hadn't woken up. "In the kitchen, miss." Zilda was already preparing coffee. Her eyes followed Eduardo as he walked past the table directly to the window overlooking the garden. She confirmed. Zilda knew who he was talking about. "She called last night asking what time you wanted. Said she's coming after lunch." Eduardo nodded, without turning. After lunch, a few hours to organize something within himself that had no form or name, something between disappointment and disgust, something between anger at Denise and anger at himself for having been blind for so long. Tomorrow passed with unbearable slowness. Eduardo tried to work from his home office, but the words in the emails made no sense. The numbers in the reports seemed to be from another language. All he could process was the sound of the house around him, Clara cleaning downstairs, the vacuum cleaner, the faucet, and, between one noise and another, the absolute silence of a woman who worked as if she were invisible. The twins had gone to school. The house was empty of that energy only children produce. And in the emptiness, Eduardo noticed something. Without the boys and without Clara, that mansion was just a building, beautiful, expensive, impeccable, but lifeless. Denise arrived punctually. Eduardo heard the click of her heels on the entrance hall floor. He heard her purse being placed on the console table. He heard her voice greeting Miss Zilda with that rehearsed friendliness he now recognized as a costume. Eduardo. He was in the living room, standing by the fireplace. He didn't sit, didn't offer a drink, didn't smile. Denise noticed immediately. Her eyes scanned his face, like someone reading a contract, looking for dangerous clauses. "What happened?" "Sit down, Denise." She sat on the couch, crossed her legs, adjusted her posture. Everything calculated, everything in place. Eduardo observed her with new eyes, the same eyes that now noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. He saw how Denise occupied the couch, as if it were hers. He saw how she glanced at the bookshelf, probably checking if the decor changes she had suggested had been made. He saw how she didn't ask about the twins. She never did. "I came home early the day before yesterday." A simple sentence. But the effect on Denise's face was like a crack in fine porcelain. Subtle, almost invisible, but irreversible. Earlier I came through the back door, stayed in the kitchen. Silence. Eduardo saw the exact moment Denise understood. Her eyes narrowed for a fraction of a second. Her jaw tightened, but her recovery was quick, impressively quick. Denise exhaled through her nose and tilted her head slightly, as if preparing to explain something obvious to someone who hadn't grasped the situation. Eduardo, I know what you saw, and I understand it might have seemed excessive, but you need to understand the context. That woman doesn't respect boundaries. She acts as if she's the mother of your children, sits on the couch, eats at the table, interferes with their upbringing. I was just trying to bring order. Eduardo listened to every word, every justification, every attempt to reframe what he had seen with his own eyes. And as Denise spoke, he remembered Clara. Clara's silence, Clara's hand on Enzo's shoulder, the firm voice that didn't need to shout to have more authority than any speech. Bring order, Eduardo repeated, not as a question but as a statement. Yes, someone needs to do that when you're not around. And pointing a finger in her face is part of that order. Denise uncrossed her legs, recrossed them. The first sign of real discomfort. I didn't point a finger in anyone's face. I saw Denise. The silence that followed was not like Clara's silence, which was made of strength and choice. Denise's silence was that of someone who had run out of a script, of someone who always had a ready answer and suddenly encountered a wall she couldn't circumvent. You're making a drama out of a staff member. Eduardo felt his blood warm, but he didn't raise his voice. He remembered Clara. If she could maintain her composure while being attacked, he could do the same. I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago. I'm paying attention. Denise got up from the couch, walked to the window, turned her back to him. Eduardo knew this movement. It was her tactic when she lost control of a conversation. Turn her back, create distance, force the other person to come to her. But Eduardo didn't. My children are afraid of you, Denise. She turned, and for the first time, Eduardo saw something that wasn't calculation or strategy. He saw genuine surprise. Fear, Eduardo, that's absurd. I never touch those children. You don't need to touch them. When you're in this house, they lock themselves in their room. They don't come down. They don't make noise. They eat in silence, and they ask to be excused from the table. Children don't do that when they feel safe. Denise opened her mouth to reply, but Eduardo continued, not with anger, but with the terrifying clarity of someone who had finally put all the pieces together. I asked my son, who he wanted to pick him up from school. Do you know what he said? He asked for Clara. He didn't ask for you. He didn't ask for the driver. He asked for the woman you humiliate when I'm not looking. Eduardo, you're being manipulated by an employee. The word came out like a shot. Employee. Not her name, not her role. Employee. Spoken with a weight that revealed exactly how Denise saw Clara, and, by extension, how she saw anyone she considered beneath her. Eduardo looked into her eyes for a long time, and when he spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper, but each syllable carried the weight of a decision already made. Clara protected my children from you, without yelling, without retaliating, without coming to tell me. She did what I should have done. And you want me to believe she's the problem? Denise blinked once, twice, and then did something Eduardo didn't expect. She didn't shout, didn't cry, didn't defend herself. She picked up her purse from the console table, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and walked to the door. She paused before leaving, turning halfway. You'll regret this. When you realize that woman wants your money, you'll remember me. And she left. The door closed with a soft click. No slam, no scene. Denise left the same way she had entered Eduardo's life, with control, with calculation, with the certainty that the world revolved around her. Eduardo stood in the empty room. Denise's perfume still lingered in the air, and along with it, a strange sensation, not of relief as he expected, but of shame. Shame for having brought that woman into his children's lives. Shame for not having seen it before. Shame for having needed to witness a scene to open his eyes. Miss Zilda appeared at the kitchen door. She said nothing, just looked at him with that gaze that said everything without uttering a syllable. It's over, Zilda. The cook nodded slowly. What needed to end has ended, but what needs to begin doesn't even have a name yet. Eduardo didn't understand at that moment, but he would carry that phrase for a long time. The afternoon wore on, and the twins returned from school. Eduardo was in the living room when they entered. They stopped at the door, looked around as if performing a security sweep, and quietly asked Miss Zilda, "Is the lady here?" "No, dear, she's not," they exhaled. Enzo came in behind him and went straight to the stairs, probably looking for Clara. He found her in the second-floor corridor, organizing bathroom towels. Enzo simply leaned his forehead against her arm and stood there silently, as if recharging. Clara placed a hand on the boy's head, without stopping what she was doing. A gesture so natural, so automatic, that it was impossible for it to be rehearsed. Eduardo watched from the base of the stairs, and at that instant, Zilda's phrase began to make sense. What needed to end had ended, but what needed to begin? The reconstruction of his relationship with his own children, the recognition of who Clara truly was, the courage to face his own failings without looking away. All of this was still a vast, unknown, and frightening territory. Eduardo went upstairs, past Clara and Enzo without saying anything, entered his office, sat in his chair, and opened the drawer where he kept Clara's employment record. 6 lines, that was all he had. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he hadn't used in ages. "Mauricio, I need a personal favor, not a professional one." His partner was surprised but listened. "I want to know more about a person, Clara de Souza Ventura. Everything public and accessible, without invading anything. I just want to understand who this woman is." Mauricio paused. "Does this have to do with how strange you were in the meeting?" "It has to do with everything." Eduardo hung up, looked out the window. The garden Clara tended without being asked was bathed in the late afternoon light. And somewhere in that house, a woman earning a modest salary was doing more for his children than all his money had ever managed to do. The question Eduardo asked himself that night was no longer about Denise. Denise was already in the past. The question now was about Clara, about who she was before she came here, about what she carried in silence, about the story no one in that house knew, and about what would happen when he finally found out. A few days passed since Denise's departure. The mansion changed, not in the furniture, not in the walls, not in the objects. It changed in the air. There was a lightness Eduardo couldn't name, but which he felt every time he entered a room and found the twins out of their room. Te drew at the living room table. Enzo ran down the hallway with a paper airplane. Simple things, things children do when they're not afraid. Eduardo was trying. Every morning he would come down before the boys, have coffee in the kitchen, wait. When they appeared, he would try to talk. The answers were still short, polite, cautious. But something was changing. They no longer looked at Enzo before answering. Enzo no longer asked permission to leave the table. These were minimal changes, almost invisible. But for Eduardo, they carried the weight of enormous achievements. Clara remained the same, professional, silent, impeccable. If she noticed Denise had left, she didn't show it. If she felt relief, she didn't let it show. She continued arriving at the same time, doing the same tasks, humming to the boys when getting them ready, leaving the glass of lemon water on Enzo's nightstand, adjusting Tay's pillow in the center of the bed. Her world didn't revolve around the dramas of employers. It revolved around what needed to be done. Eduardo observed her with an attention that sometimes bothered him. He wasn't quite sure what he was looking for. Perhaps a flaw, perhaps a sign that Denise was right, that Clara had some hidden interest, some agenda, some disguised ambition. But the more he looked, the less he found. Clara didn't ask for a raise, didn't mention Denise's departure, didn't try to occupy any new space. She remained exactly where she had always been. And that was precisely what disturbed Eduardo. The absolute consistency of someone whose behavior didn't change depending on who was watching. One afternoon, Mauricio called. "I found what you asked for, but I think we should talk in person." His partner's tone ignited something in Eduardo. Mauricio was a pragmatic, direct man who solved problems over the phone in 3 minutes. If he was asking for an in-person conversation, what he found wasn't simple. They met in the holdings office. Mauricio closed the door, placed a folder on the table, and sat in the opposite chair. "Before I open this, I need you to understand something. Everything here is public information, records, accessible documents, local news. I didn't invade anyone's privacy." "Understood. Tell me." Mauricio opened the folder. Clara de Souza Ventura, born in the interior, raised by her maternal grandmother, after her mother died when she was still a child. Her father left the scene before she was born. Her grandmother did what she could. Clara went to public school, worked from an early age, managed to finish high school with good grades, had plans to study social work. Eduardo listened, motionless. She didn't pursue it though, because her grandmother fell ill. Clara dropped everything to take care of her. Those were some difficult years. Her grandmother eventually passed away. Clara was left alone, without family, without a support network, without anything. She started working as a daily cleaner to survive. Mauricio turned a page. This is where it gets interesting. Clara has a brother, Renato de Souza Ventura, older, a labor lawyer, graduated from a local university. He was able to study because Clara sent him money. She worked in 3 different houses to pay for his college. Eduardo felt the chair become uncomfortable, not because of the chair, but because of the weight of what he was hearing. She paid for her brother's entire college education. Renato graduated, passed the bar exam, opened a small office, focused on domestic workers' rights. Today he represents cleaners, nannies, caregivers, people who don't have money to pay a lawyer. He charges symbolic fees or works pro bono. And according to everything I found, his motivation is Clara. He saw what his sister went through, saw the humiliations, the employers who didn't pay, the houses where she was treated as if she wasn't human, and he decided he would fight for people like her. Eduardo got up from his chair, went to the office window. The city stretched out below, buildings, cars, millions of people living lives he would never stop to imagine. Mauricio hesitated. There is. And I almost didn't include this part in the folder. Tell me, Mauricio. Clara was fired from the house where she worked before yours, a family in an affluent neighborhood in the suburbs. The official reason was cost-cutting, but I found an old social media post. The family's daughter posted it at the time. The post was later deleted, but it remained in cached records. What did it say? It said that the mother fired Clara because the father of the family had praised the food Clara prepared for the children one weekend. The wife interpreted it as something it wasn't. Clara was sent away without notice, without full settlement, without a letter of reference. Eduardo remained silent for a long time, his hands resting on the window pane. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger. She lost her job because she cooked for the children. She lost her job because someone was jealous of the care she offered. Does that sound familiar? Mauricio's question was too precise to be ignored. Eduardo turned around. Denise, I'm not saying it's the same situation. I'm saying Clara has been through this before, being punished for caring too much. And even so, when she came to your house, she did exactly the same thing. She cared for your children as if they were her own. Knowing the risk, Eduardo returned to his chair, picked up the folder, leafed through the pages. Employment records, addresses, an old digitized photo from a local newspaper, a high school graduation, a small class, and in the corner, almost cut off by the photo's margin, a young woman with a discreet smile, holding her diploma with both hands. The caption read, Graduates of Maplewood Public School, Clara. Eduardo closed the folder, staring at the beige cover for a time. Mauricio didn't dare interrupt. Mauricio, how much does Clara earn in my house? His partner frowned. I don't have that information, but by market standards for the position, it must be something between. It doesn't matter the number. Whatever it is, it's not enough. Eduardo, be careful. You're emotional. Decisions made like this. It's not emotion, it's shame. I have a woman in my house who gave up her own life to care for the lives of others, who paid for her brother's education by cleaning floors, who was fired for caring too much, and who every morning still comes into my house and treats my children as if they were the most precious things in the world. And I didn't even know her full name until 4 days ago. Mauricio didn't reply. There were some things that had no answer. Eduardo left the office that afternoon with the folder under his arm and a clarity that hurt like an open wound. Every piece of information about Clara was a mirror reflecting his own smallness, not financial smallness. In that, Eduardo was a giant. The human smallness, the inability to see the value of someone who didn't use value as a bargaining chip. When he got home, the first thing he heard was laughter. It came from the garden. Eduardo went to the back door and stopped. Clara was kneeling near the flower bed she herself cultivated. Tea was beside her, hands dirty with soil, planting something small in a pot. Enzo held the watering can with both hands, concentrated, pouring water with exaggerated care not to overwater. Slowly, Enzo. She needs water, but she doesn't want to drown, Clara said. And the 3 laughed. Eduardo stood at the door, watching. The folder with Clara's story weighed in his left hand. And there, in that garden, the story took on substance. It was no longer a report. It was a real woman, on her knees in the dirt, teaching his children to care for something alive. A woman who had never had anyone care for her. Tay looked up and saw his father at the door. Dad, Clara's teaching us to plant. This one's going to bloom. It was the first time Tay had spoken to him with genuine enthusiasm, without caution, without measuring words, as a child speaks when they forget they need to be careful around adults. Eduardo descended the 3 steps leading to the garden. He knelt beside his son. What kind of flower? Clara said it's one that takes a long time to grow, but when it opens, it's the most beautiful of all. Eduardo looked at Clara. Her hands were in the dirt, her eyes on the pots, her face serene like someone who didn't need an audience to be who she was. He felt her notice his gaze, but she didn't look up. She kept working. "Is that true, Clara? Does it take a long time to grow?" Clara nodded without looking at him. Things worth waiting for usually do. The phrase hung in the afternoon air. Eduardo didn't know if she was talking about the plant or something bigger, and perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Clara never needed to explain anything. Perhaps her entire life was the explanation. Every gesture, every silence, every choice she made without anyone watching. That night, Eduardo put his children to sleep by himself for the first time. He tried. He got Enzo's milk temperature wrong. He forgot to check under the bed. He didn't know what story Tay wanted to hear. He did everything wrong, but he stayed. And when the boys finally fell asleep, Tay on his stomach, Enzo wrapped in his blanket, Eduardo left the room and found Clara in the corridor. She was going to check on the boys, as she did every night. They stopped, facing each other. The corridor was narrow, the light dim. "They're asleep," Eduardo said. Clara nodded, made a move to turn and leave. "Clara," she stopped. "Thank you." One word, 2 syllables. But Clara stood still for an instant too long to be indifferent. Her shoulders moved, that controlled breath Eduardo now knew. When she turned, her eyes were moist, but her voice was firm. "No need to thank me, they deserve it." And she walked away down the corridor. Eduardo stood there, looking at the empty space where Clara had been, and understood that phrase, "they deserve it," was the key to everything. Clara didn't care for the twins out of obligation, salary, or strategy. She cared because she truly believed those children deserved to be cared for, simply because they existed. And if someone who had nothing could give so much, what did it mean to be someone who had everything and gave nothing? Eduardo entered his office, opened Mauricio's folder once more, looked at the graduation photo, and made a decision that fit no contract and no lawyer needed to review. He was going to get to know Clara for real, not the file, not the report, the person. But what Eduardo still didn't know was that Clara also held something that wasn't in Mauricio's folder, something no public record could reveal. And when that truth came to light, it wouldn't just be his life that changed, it would be the lives of everyone in that house. Eduardo began to change his routine, not in a grand or announced way, but quietly, almost timidly, like someone relearning to walk after a long time sitting still. He started leaving the office earlier, having dinner at home, asking the twins about school, about their drawings, about the dreams they had at night. The answers still came slowly, measured as if the boys were testing the solidity of this new presence before trusting it. But there was progress. One of those nights, Tay showed a drawing without Eduardo asking. It was a boat in the middle of the sea with 3 figures inside. Eduardo looked carefully. "Who are these people in the boat?" "Me, Enzo, and Clara." Eduardo waited, looked for a 4th figure. There wasn't one. "And where am I?" Tay looked at the drawing as if the question made no sense. "You're at work, Dad." The phrase came not with malice, but with naturalness, with the implacable logic of a child describing the world as it is, unfiltered and without mercy. Eduardo was the man who was at work. That's how his children saw him. That's how he had built himself in their minds. A figure associated with absence. Eduardo nodded, didn't correct, didn't ask to be included in the drawing. He understood that that place in the boat had to be earned, not requested. The days passed, and the house found a kind of new balance. Without Denise, the atmosphere breathed. The twins came down for breakfast without doing a sweep of the living room. Miss Zilda cooked humming, and Clara continued to be Clara, present without invading, careful without asking for recognition, firm without needing volume. But Eduardo began to notice something he hadn't before. Clara left the house every Wednesday afternoon, always at the same time. She always came back with eyes slightly different, not red, not swollen, but heavy with something burdensome. Miss Zilda covered her shift without anyone needing to ask. It was a silent old agreement that worked without words. The first time, Eduardo paid no attention. The second, he registered it. The third time, curiosity turned into unease. "Zilda, where does Clara go on Wednesdays?" The cook was peeling vegetables. Her hands paused for a second, just a second, before resuming movement. "That's Clara's business, Eduardo." It was the first time Zilda had called him by his first name without the mister. And it was the first time she refused to answer his question. Both things together formed a clear message. There was a limit there, a territory that wasn't his. Eduardo respected it, or tried to, but the unease didn't stop growing. Not out of suspicion, but out of concern. A concern he didn't know where it came from, or where it was going, but which occupied an increasingly large space in his chest. The following Wednesday, Eduardo made a decision he knew was invasive. He left the office in the middle of the afternoon, drove himself, without a chauffeur, and parked a safe distance from the house. He saw Clara leave through the side gate. She walked to the bus stop, waited, got on. Eduardo followed the bus, not with pride, but with shame. He knew he was crossing a line, but something inside him said he needed to understand, not to control. He had done that his whole life, and the result was the disaster he was living. He needed to understand, because Clara deserved to be understood, because he had spent 3 years beside a person and knew nothing about her beyond 6 lines on a file. The bus headed for the north end. Clara got off in a neighborhood Eduardo had never set foot in. Narrow streets, modest houses, local shops with faded signs. She walked 3 blocks and entered a low-rise building with a simple facade, a discreet sign at the entrance, the Havenwood Center for Support and Healing. Eduardo parked, stayed in the car. His heart pounded in a way he didn't recognize. It wasn't the adrenaline of negotiations. It wasn't the tension of contracts. It was fear. Fear of discovering something that would make everything more complicated than it already was. He waited. An hour passed. Clara left the building, accompanied by an older woman wearing an institutional badge. The two talked on the sidewalk for a few minutes. Clara listened more than she spoke. At one point, the woman touched Clara's arm with a gesture that mixed comfort and encouragement. Clara nodded, waved, and walked back to the bus stop. Eduardo didn't follow her back. He stayed in the car, looking at the facade of the Havenwood Center, until the sun began to set and the streetlights came on. That night, Eduardo couldn't remain silent. He waited for the twins to fall asleep. He waited for Clara to finish her nightly rounds in the rooms. And when she came downstairs to put away the last materials before leaving, he was in the kitchen. "Clara, can I speak with you for a minute?" She stopped on the last step, looked at him with that neutral expression. Eduardo now knew, the polite wall she maintained between herself and the world. "Of course, Mr. Eduardo. Please, sit." Clara sat on the island bench, her hands in her lap, her posture erect, ready to hear a complaint, an instruction, a demand, ready for whatever an employer might say to an employee at the end of the workday. Eduardo sat across from her and did something Clara didn't expect. "I need to apologize to you." Her face didn't change, but her hands moved. Her fingers intertwined more tightly in her lap. "Apologize for what, sir?" "For everything. For what Denise did to you. For the time I didn't see. For the time I didn't ask. For reducing 3 years of your life in this house to a 6-line file." Clara swallowed hard. The wall trembled, but it didn't fall. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do, and I need to tell you something else. I know you go to the Havenwood Center on Wednesdays." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences Eduardo had witnessed in that house. It wasn't Clara's dignified silence in front of Denise. It wasn't the twins' awkward silence in front of their father. It was a silence of vulnerability, the silence of someone found in the only place where she allowed herself to be fragile. Clara looked away. For the first time since Eduardo knew her, she didn't maintain eye contact. She looked at her own hands, at her intertwined fingers that now trembled slightly. "I didn't do anything wrong. I know you didn't. Wednesdays are my afternoon off. I've never missed work, never been late, never failed to. Clara." Eduardo's voice was low, but firm enough to interrupt her. "I'm not questioning your work. I never would. I just want to know if you're okay." Clara looked at him, and in her eyes, Eduardo saw something he recognized, because he himself had felt it in recent days. The exhaustion of carrying something too heavy, for too long, without anyone to share it with. "My grandmother," Clara began, and her voice failed on the first attempt. She took a deep breath, started again. "My grandmother raised me. When she got sick, I took care of her until the end. Those were difficult years. After she was gone, I thought I had gotten over it. But some things you don't get over. You learn to live with them." Eduardo listened without interrupting, without moving a muscle. The Havenwood Center is a place where people who have lost someone important can talk. It's not treatment. It's not an obligation. It's just a place where I can talk about my grandmother without having to be strong. Clara's voice remained steady until the last sentence, but her hands told another story. They trembled, and Eduardo understood that this woman who protected his children with the firmness of a shield, who faced humiliation without backing down, who maintained dignity in all situations, this woman also needed a place where she could let go of the burden. "Every week?" Eduardo asked, almost in a whisper. Every week, for almost 4 years. 4 years. Clara had been frequenting that center since before she worked in his house. She had carried her grandmother's grief for so long that it was already part of who she was. And no one knew, no one asked, no one looked at her enough to realize that every Wednesday that unshakable woman went to a place where she allowed herself to break down. Eduardo extended his hand over the table, not touching Clara, just leaving his hand there in the space between them, like a bridge she could cross or not. You don't have to be strong here either, Clara. Not anymore. Clara looked at his hand, looked at his face, and did something Eduardo had never seen her do. She cried silently, without sobs. The tears simply streamed down her face, as if they had waited years for permission. Clara didn't wipe them away, didn't apologize, didn't get up to leave. She just sat there in the kitchen of the mansion where she worked, crying in front of the man who was her employer, letting fall the armor she had worn since she learned no one would protect her. Miss Zilda appeared at the kitchen door, saw the scene, and for the first time in 15 years of service in that house, the cook smiled with tear-filled eyes and silently retreated into the corridor without interrupting. Eduardo said nothing more. He didn't need to. Some things don't require words, they require presence. And in that kitchen, on a common night of any week, two people who had lived under the same roof for 3 years finally truly saw each other. But what neither of them knew was that that night in the kitchen wouldn't remain between them, because someone had seen Denise's farewell message on social media, a vague post, full of veiled hints, about being replaced by someone undeserving. And that post was already reaching the eyes of the only person who could turn Clara's life into a battlefield. Renato Ventura, her brother, was already on his way. The doorbell rang one late afternoon when no one expected visitors. Eduardo was in his office reviewing documents. The twins were playing in the garden with Clara. Miss Zilda went to the door, drying her hands on her apron, and opened it with the calm of someone who opens that door every day. The man on the other side was not calm. He was tall, with rigid posture, a leather briefcase under his arm, and eyes like someone who had come for a war. Miss Zilda looked him up and down, and before he said anything, the cook already knew who he was. He had Clara's same eyes, the same jawline, the same way of pressing his lips together when holding something inside. I need to speak with the owner of this house. And who shall I announce? Renato Ventura, Clara's brother. Miss Zilda didn't move immediately. She stood there for a moment, measuring the man like someone measuring the depth of water before stepping in. Then she nodded and went to the office. Eduardo, there's a man at the door. Says he's Clara's brother. Eduardo rose from his chair. Something tightened in his chest, not surprise, but the feeling that something pending had finally arrived. He went downstairs and walked to the entrance. Renato Ventura stood in the hall, radiating hostility. His eyes scanned the mansion with a mixture of anger and discomfort, like someone entering a courtroom knowing the rules were written by the other party. Mr. Matarado. Eduardo. Mr. Matarado, Renato repeated, and the deliberate choice of formality said everything that needed to be said about the tone of that conversation. I've come to take my sister. Eduardo felt the floor move beneath his feet. Not physically, but emotionally. Take Clara. Take her away. The possibility had never crossed his mind, and the fact that it hadn't revealed how much he still thought of Clara as someone who belonged in that house. Someone who would always be there, available, present, as if her dedication were a permanent resource he could use without ever asking the cost. Can we talk? Eduardo indicated the living room. I don't need a couch, I don't need coffee, and I don't need pleasantries. I saw what your girlfriend posted on social media. I saw the veiled hints. I called Clara, and she brushed it off, as she always does. So I came in person. Renato opened the leather briefcase, took out printed pages, and placed them on the hall console table, like someone presenting evidence at a hearing. My sister has worked in this house for 3 years. During that time, she was humiliated, disrespected, and threatened by the person you chose to bring into your children's lives. And Clara never said a word. Do you know why? Eduardo didn't answer. He knew the question expected no answer. Because she's afraid of losing her job. Because she's been fired before for caring too much. Because every time my sister dedicates herself to a family that isn't hers, someone finds a reason to cast her aside. And now I find out that your girlfriend went around publishing on social media that she was replaced by an employee. The word cut through the air for the second time in that story. Employee. The same word Denise had used. In Renato's mouth, however, it wasn't contempt. It was pain. The pain of a brother who had watched his sister be reduced to a function her entire life. Renato, I need you to... You don't need anything, sir. Clara is the one who needs. She needs someone to look out for her, because she never looks out for herself. She gives everything and keeps nothing. And people like you get used to it, get used to her dedication, her silence, her strength, until one day they break her and throw her away. Eduardo listened to every word, didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself, didn't raise his voice, stood in the hall of his own house, listening to a man who earned a fraction of what he earned speak truths that were worth more than any consultancy Eduardo had ever hired. When Renato finished, breathing heavily, his eyes shining with the intensity of someone who had held that in for too long, Eduardo did the only thing he could do. "You're right." Renato blinked. The response visibly disarmed him. He expected resistance. He expected arrogance. He expected the pattern he knew from all the employers he had faced in his law office: denial, minimization, counterattack. He didn't expect agreement. "Everything you said is right," Eduardo continued. "I didn't see what was happening inside my own house. I brought someone who mistreated the most important person to my children, and I reduced 3 years of your sister's life to a 6-line file in a drawer." Renato frowned. Eduardo continued. "I know about her grandmother. I know Clara cared for her until the end. I know she gave up her own dreams for it. I know she paid for your college by cleaning 3 houses. I know she was fired from the family in the affluent neighborhood because someone was jealous of the care she gave the children. And I know that every Wednesday she goes to the Havenwood Center because she still carries a grief no one in this house had the decency to notice." The silence that followed was different from all previous silences in the story. It wasn't Clara's dignified silence, nor Denise's calculated silence, nor the twins' embarrassed silence. It was the silence of 2 men measuring each other, not as enemies, but as 2 people who loved the same woman in different ways, and who, for the first time, were face to face to decide what to do about it. "How do you know all this, sir?" Renato asked, his voice softer now. "Because I finally stopped signing contracts for 5 minutes and paid attention." Renato didn't smile, but the line of his shoulders dropped an inch. His jaw relaxed a fraction. The leather briefcase hung by his side like a weapon no longer needed. "And what do you intend to do, sir?" Before Eduardo could answer, a voice cut across the hall. "Renato!" Clara was at the door leading to the garden. The twins were behind her, Teo with hands dirty with soil, Enzo holding a small pot with the seedling they had planted weeks before. Clara looked at her brother with an expression that mixed surprise, love, and something very much like fear. "What are you doing here?" "I came to get you, Clara." "Get me?" "I saw what that woman posted. I know what happened in this house, and I'm not going to let you go through that again." Clara looked at Eduardo, then at Renato, then at the twins, who watched the scene with wide eyes, sensing the adult's tension without understanding the cause. "Boys, go up to your room. I'll be right there." The twins didn't move. Enzo stepped forward and took Clara's hand. Tay stayed where he was, but his chin lifted, that gesture he had copied from Clara on the first day when she faced Denise. "Is Clara leaving?" Enzo asked, and his voice carried the weight of a question he had asked before and had sworn to himself he would never have to ask again. Clara knelt, got down to his level, held the boy's face with both hands. "I'm not going anywhere. Remember what I told you?" Enzo nodded slowly. "As long as you need me, I'll be here." Renato watched the scene, and something in his face changed. The anger didn't disappear. It was still there, ingrained, built up over years of watching his sister suffer. But alongside the anger, something else was born. The recognition that perhaps for the first time, Clara's dedication was not unilateral. Those children truly loved her, not as one loves toys or habits, but as one loves someone who makes the world feel safe. Clara stood up and led the boys inside. When she returned, she was alone. She stopped between Eduardo and Renato like someone who refused to be the object of a dispute. "Renato, I appreciate you coming. I know you worry, but I'm not that little girl who needed you to solve everything anymore. I chose to be here. I choose to stay, not out of obligation, not out of fear of losing my job, but because these children need me, and I need them." Renato opened his mouth to reply, but Clara raised her hand. "And if one day I decide to leave, it will be my decision, not Mr. Eduardo's, not his ex-girlfriend's, and not yours, mine." The hall fell silent. Eduardo felt something he had never felt for Clara. Not admiration, which already existed, not gratitude, which was already immense. He felt respect, the respect of someone who understands they are before someone who doesn't need to be rescued, who never needed to be. Renato looked at his sister for a long time, then looked at Eduardo, and then did something no one expected. He extended his hand. "If anything happens to her in this house, I'll be back, and it won't be to talk. Eduardo shook his hand. If anything happens to her in this house, I'll call you myself. Renato nodded. He hugged his sister. A long, tight hug, the kind that says everything the mouth refuses to utter. Clara held her brother with the same strength, and for an instant, Eduardo saw in her the girl who lost her grandmother, who was left alone, who worked so her brother could study. He saw the whole woman, not just the part he knew. Renato left with a leather briefcase under his arm, his posture a little less rigid, his steps a little less heavy. Eduardo stood at the door, watching his car disappear down the street. Clara was beside him in silence. Your brother loves you very much. He feels guilty. He thinks he should have helped me more when Grandma got sick. I never let him think differently. Maybe that was my mistake. It's not a mistake to protect someone you love. Clara looked at him, and for the second time, Eduardo saw the wall tremble. No, it's not. That night, a storm broke over the city. The wind rattled the mansion windows with a force that made the panes vibrate. Eduardo was in his office when he heard something that made him jump from his chair. A low, muffled cry coming from the twins' room. He ran down the corridor, opened the door. Enzo was sitting on his bed, huddled, with the blanket pulled up to his chin, his eyes full of tears. With each thunderclap, the boy's body contracted as if expecting a blow. Eduardo sat on the bed next to him. He didn't know what to do. He had no script for this. He had no experience. So he did what he had seen Clara do. The only reference he had for how to care for a frightened child. He pulled Enzo close, put his arm around him, and sat there in silence while the thunder shook the world outside. Dad, I don't like the noise. Dad, not sir. Dad. Eduardo closed his eyes, hugged his son tighter, and felt tears streaming down his own face. Unbidden, unannounced, uncontrolled, because that single word, Dad, was worth more than any contract, any figure, any achievement he had ever accumulated in his entire life. I know, son, I'm here. Enzo leaned his head on Eduardo's chest. The thunder continued, but the boy stopped trembling. They woke up with the noise, looked at the scene, said nothing, got out of his own bed, crossed the room, and squeezed himself under his father's free arm. Eduardo held both of them, one on each side, his hands open on his children's backs. And in that room, in the middle of the storm, something finally rebuilt itself. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't complete. It was a beginning, fragile, like a freshly planted seedling, but alive. At the bedroom door, a shadow stopped. Clara had come to check on the boys as she did every night. She saw Eduardo holding his two sons. She saw Enzo leaning against his father's chest. She saw Tay clinging to his arm. She didn't enter. She didn't need to. She leaned against the doorframe, crossed her arms, and smiled. A small, silent smile that no one saw. The smile of someone who planted something with her own hands and finally sees the first sprout breaking through the earth. The next morning, the storm broke with a clean sky that seemed washed. Light streamed through the mansion windows with a different intensity, as if the sun itself wanted to illuminate what had previously been hidden in the corners. Eduardo woke up in the twins' room, sitting in the armchair between the two beds, his neck stiff and his back protesting every hour slept in that position. But he was smiling. Enzo was still sleeping, wrapped in his blanket, his face serene, with no trace of the previous night's fear. Tay was awake, lying on his stomach, drawing in the notebook he never let go of. When he realized his father had opened his eyes, he held up the notebook and showed him. Look, Dad. Eduardo leaned in. The drawing showed 3 figures under a blanket, rain falling around them, and all 3 figures were smiling. Below, in his usual shaky, enormous handwriting, Tay had written, "The Thunder Night." Eduardo looked at the drawing for a long time, then at his son. "Can I keep this one?" Tay tore the page from the notebook and handed it to him with a naturalness that was beautiful in its tenderness, as if giving something to his father was finally a meaningful gesture. Eduardo folded the paper and put it in his pocket. He now carried 2 drawings. The first, the man with the briefcase, alone on the other side of the paper. It was the accusation. The second was the beginning of the answer. The days that followed were not magical. There was no instant transformation. Eduardo still made mistakes. He forgot that Enzo didn't like the crust of bread. He put too much toothpaste on Tay's brush. He tried to tell bedtime stories and lost his train of thought midway, inventing absurd endings that made the twins laugh not at the story, but at the disaster their father made of telling it. But he stayed every night, even when the boys fell asleep quickly, even when he had urgent emails, even when his body craved his bed, and not the cramped armchair between his son's 2 beds. Eduardo stayed, and little by little, imperceptibly, The ice began to melt. Enzo started waiting for his father at the bedroom door before bed, holding the glass of lemon water. Clara prepared, as if to show Eduardo that this was the ritual, and he was now a part of it. Te began drawing with the door open, instead of hiding his notebooks under his pillow. Small changes, enormous achievements. Clara observed everything with her usual discretion. She didn't withdraw, but she made space. Where before she was the only nighttime presence in the twins' room, now there was Eduardo, and she adjusted her orbit without jealousy, without resentment, with the wisdom of someone who understands that the best thing that could happen to those children was to have their father back. One afternoon, Eduardo found her in the garden. Clara was kneeling near the flower bed, tending to the seedlings she had planted with the boys weeks before. Eduardo stopped beside her and looked at the pots. "Any news?" Clara pointed to one of the seedlings. At the top of the slender stem, something was emerging. Small, closed, but unmistakable. "It's coming. A few more days, and it will open." Eduardo knelt beside her, looked at that tiny bud that insisted on existing, despite the soil, the weather, and the storm that had lashed the garden days before. "You said things worth waiting for usually take time." Clara nodded without looking at him, her hands in the dirt, her eyes on the plant. "And was it worth waiting for?" Clara stopped what she was doing, remained motionless for an instant, and then looked at him, not with the professional wall, not with the neutrality of an employee, but with the eyes of someone who allows herself to be seen, always. Eduardo held her gaze, and in that garden, kneeling in the dirt, with dirty hands, and the silence of the late afternoon around them, something settled between the two. It wasn't declared, it wasn't named, it didn't need to be. There were things that existed before words, and this was one of them. Weeks later, Renato returned to the mansion. This time, he didn't ring the doorbell with hostility. He rang and waited with his hands in his pockets, looking at the garden with an expression that mixed caution and curiosity. Miss Zilda opened the door and, for the first time, smiled at him. "Clara's brother, come in." Renato entered and found something he didn't expect. The twins were in the dining room with Clara and Eduardo. Te was drawing. Enzo was building something with blocks. Clara helped Enzo balance a tower, while Eduardo watched, trying to suggest a piece, and being vetoed by his son with a hand gesture that made everyone laugh. Renato stood at the entrance of the room, observing as Eduardo had observed on the first day from the door, unseen, trying to understand what was happening within a scene he wasn't part of. But this time, someone saw him. "Uncle Renato!" The twins ran to him. Renato knelt down and received them both with an awkward hug of someone who isn't practiced with children, but who tries with everything he has. Clara laughed. An open, uninhibited laugh that Eduardo had never heard before. The sound filled the entire room. Renato stood and looked at Eduardo. The two measured each other for an instant, a remnant of the previous confrontation, of the distrust that still lingered like a thin cloud. But Eduardo extended his hand first. "Stay for dinner." Renato looked at Clara. She nodded with a discreet smile. He shook Eduardo's hand. "I'll stay." Dinner took place at the kitchen table, not in the formal dining room with 12 place settings and silver cutlery, in the kitchen. Miss Zilda served the food, complaining that she hadn't prepared enough, though there was enough food for twice as many people. They sat next to Renato and showed him his drawings. Enzo sat next to Clara, as always, but with a difference. His father's chair was right there, and every now and then, the boy would look at Eduardo and smile. Renato told stories from his law office, cases of workers who won their rights, small victories that for the people involved were immense. Clara listened with a silent pride that couldn't be contained on her face. Eduardo listened with something that resembled admiration. The admiration of someone who recognizes that there are battles more important than those fought in boardrooms with city views. At one point, Te pulled out his notebook and began drawing during dinner. No one complained. No one told him to put it away. When he finished, he turned the notebook towards the table. 5 stick figures inside a large boat, all together, all smiling. And below, in his familiar shaky handwriting, "My family." Eduardo looked at the drawing, counted the figures. 5. 2 boys, a woman beside them, a man on the other side, and another older figure in the center, Miss Zilda, with what appeared to be a pot in her hand. No figure was alone. No figure held a briefcase. All were inside the boat. Eduardo got up from the table, left the kitchen, walked to the hall, leaned against the wall, and reached into his suit pocket, where the 2 previous drawings were still folded. He took out the first, the man with the briefcase, alone, separated from his family. He took out the second, the Thunder Knight, 3 figures under a blanket, and now the third, the boat, all together. 3 drawings, 3 chapters of the same transformation, written by a child who didn't use words to say what he felt, but who said everything with pencil and paper. Miss Zilda appeared in the hall, looked at him, looked at the 3 drawings open in his hands, and said with the calm voice of someone who has been waiting for a moment for a long time, "What needed to begin now has a name, Eduardo." He looked at her. His eyes stung, his throat tightened. "And what is the name, Zilda?" The cook smiled. The same smile she had given the night she saw Clara cry in the kitchen. The smile of someone watching a family build itself brick by brick, meal by meal, silence by silence. "Go back inside. You'll find out for yourself." Eduardo returned to the kitchen, sat in his chair. They immediately pushed the notebook towards him, asking to draw together. Eduardo picked up the pencil and drew something horrible, a misshapen figure that was supposed to be a dog. Enzo burst out laughing. Clara covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. Renato had no such mercy and laughed openly. "Dad, is that a dog or a couch?" Te asked. "Dad." Without formality, without distance, without the weight of the sir that had marked all previous days, just Dad, spoken with the naturalness of someone who finally believes the word belongs to that person. Eduardo laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from deep within and doesn't ask permission. Sometime later, on a Sunday morning, Eduardo went down to the garden and found Clara kneeling before the flower bed. Beside her, the twins. The 3 looked at the seedling they had planted together. The flower had opened. It was small, delicate, with petals that seemed fragile, but which had survived the storm, the cold, and the waiting. Clara touched one of the petals with the tip of her finger, as if verifying it was real. Enzo looked at his father. "Dad, come see." It bloomed. Eduardo descended the steps and knelt beside his children. He looked at the flower, then at Clara. She was smiling. That rare, true smile, which wasn't for an audience or for protocol. It was hers. Only hers. "It took time," Eduardo said. "But it opened," Clara replied. Te extended his hand to Enzo. Enzo extended his hand to Clara. Clara looked at Eduardo, and Eduardo, without saying anything, placed his hand over the hands of the 3. 4 hands stacked, like a renewed pact, stronger than the first, because now it had someone who was previously missing. Eduardo didn't become a perfect father. He still worked too much, still forgot details, still told stories with disastrous endings that made the twins laugh for the wrong reason, but he was present not as a visitor, but as a constant, imperfect, and real presence. Clara didn't become another person. She continued going to the Havenwood Center on Wednesdays. She continued carrying her grandmother's grief as part of who she was. She continued to be silent, strong, and unshakable when she needed to be. But now, occasionally, she allowed herself not to be strong, allowed herself to laugh loudly in the kitchen, allowed herself to cry when longing became overwhelming, allowed herself to exist not just as the woman who cared, but as the woman who was also cared for. Renato began visiting the mansion frequently. He never completely lost his distrust. It was part of his temperament, his history, the armor he wore to protect his sister, but he saw enough to understand that this time was different. Not perfect, different. Miss Zilda remained in the kitchen, continued to see everything, continued to say little and mean much. And one of those afternoons, while organizing the next week's provisions, she looked out the kitchen window and saw something that made her stop. Eduardo was in the garden, sitting on the grass beside Clara. The twins ran around them. They carried his drawing book under his arm. Enzo held a watering can that was too big for him, spilling water everywhere but on the plant. And Clara was telling a story, the same story of the bird that couldn't fly, but that walked so far it knew more places than all the other birds combined. Only this time, the story had a different ending. And one day, Clara said, while the twins stopped running to listen, the bird found other birds who also liked to walk. And he discovered that he didn't need to fly to go far. He just needed company for the journey. Enzo sat on Clara's lap. They sat next to his father, and the 4 stayed there in the garden. Clara cultivated, without anyone asking. Under the light of a late afternoon that was in no hurry to end, Miss Zilda smiled from the window, wiped a tear with her apron, and returned to the kitchen. Some stories don't end with grand gestures, don't end with public declarations, nor with perfect endings tied with golden bows. Some stories end in the simplest and most powerful way possible, with someone who finally found their place, and with someone who was finally seen.